what I'm going to speak on is something called behavioural economics. So if I could start off with a bit of audience participation. Has anybody heard of behavioural economics? Could you put your hands up, please? Great, so not everybody's putting their hands up. Best way to explain it is, if you know economics, and I say hopefully everybody will put their hands up on economics, and psychology, it's putting the two together. Okay, so that's what and actually this has been a recent phenomena. Economics certainly since Adam Smith, so over 200 years, has had a view about how humans think. And they are basically, the view is that humans think pretty much like Dr. Spock. And that is that they are very rational, that they are optimizers, they maximize, that they get themselves fully informed over every decision that they make, and that they're not put off by other people. They make those decisions independently. And I've been, although I was 10 years as a plumber, actually I've been 30 years as an economist nearly. And over that time, I've been using that model, and I've been feeling very uncomfortable about it. Partly because, well, I got 3 children, and they never seemed to behave like that when they were young, when they were teenagers, and now as adults. And then I realised I don't behave like that either. And then I'm using this model. And then fortunately, I also managed to make a few mistakes or errors in my economics. I gave some advice, realised actually afterwards that wasn't the right advice, and why. And then when what I've realised was it was actually to do with my understanding about how humans actually are, how they really behave. And so I was delighted when this new area of psychology started to enter economics. And it started in the early 70s and has built up at a pace. So it was in academia, but built up a pace, and so in the last 10, 12 years has really influenced policy making, and that's the bit that I'd like to focus on. Because I do have this passion that policy needs to be efficient, it needs to be effective, and it needs to offer great value for money. Not just for us as individuals, but for businesses, and also for those who deliver the policy. They want it to be really, really good. And I feel that this area of behavioural economics can help us with that. So the other areas of, just in passing, where I think this new psychology is really useful, is our own personal world. I've learned a lot as a businessman about my own biases, about how I've had to actually reflect on those, and that leads me to have better decisions. Our boardroom meetings are better now because we've had people come in and talk to us about how our brains work. And actually it's been fun. I can't tell you how enjoyable it is to go to a board meeting compared to 10 years ago when it was put on the armour. So throughout, I think, behavioural economics, psychology, and its growth in the last 40 years has really been quite fundamental. And the key thing it's telling us is that we live with biases. We are not purely rational people. We have this fast-moving part of our brain that's been around for many, many years, and that is a key driver of the way we might think about things. And trying to understand how that works is key. So let's call that the fast part of the brain. We also have a slower moving part of the brain, and that's evolved over a shorter period. And that is a bit more rational, it is more reflective, you are thinking. And actually, human beings are the combination of these two things. So suddenly, if that door opens now, and somebody comes in, they don't have to have a gun or they don't have to look aggressive, but I will be very alert to what is happening, and I will have a fight or flight mode that immediately kicks off. That isn't my slow part of my brain. That's the fast part of my brain, responding extremely quickly. Slow part of my brain starts picking up evidence, picking up what are they wearing, have they got a smile on their face, do they look like possibly somebody who's late for lunch. And that, in turn, will make me change my view about the situation. But the fast part is really a key driver. And actually, it turns out, we found in many, many experiments, that actually a lot of people's decisions are driven by this fast part. And that is quite important to know if you're trying to understand if I introduce a policy tomorrow and it's trying to get people to change their behaviours, I need to know that bit and how that works, rather than assuming, oh, if I give them a subsidy or give them an incentive, they'll suddenly all move in the direction I want to. Many politicians, ministers I've advised, have thought that their policies were going to be effective. In fact, I won't say who this Chancellor is, but a very reasonably famous UK Chancellor every summer would go to the US, meet the sort of intelligentsia in the US in various intellectual schools, and come back with policies, ready-baked policies. And then he would say, wrap that up and get it ready for me. I really think that's going to work. And the people I worked with, or if we were advising, we'd feel really disappointed that this wasn't going to be tested, and it was based on just a pure belief, great desire to want things to be better, but pure belief. Whereas I think now we are more in a mode of testing things out because we've learnt to be more cautious, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Right, so that's the intro on behavioural economics. I'm now going to tell you a bit more about how it actually works, and there's many different ways our brains are impacted on by this fast part of the system. And I'm just going to talk about three factors that can influence the way we make our choices. So I'm going to kick off with one. Actually, before I do, if you're interested in reading more about it, these are the two best-selling books, Nudge on the left, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow by my hero, Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner in this subject area. And as I said, human biases, this vast part of our brain, the way it works, prevents us making from rational decisions, and sometimes despite our best efforts. That's the really important bit. It's not like we know we've got this thing that's working and we can beat it. Actually, sometimes and quite often it wins. So I'm going to move to the first concept, and it's called framing. And there's a lot of evidence to show that the starting bit of information that you give people will determine their choices. And if you give them two different starting points, they will actually choose different things. So here's two chickens. Don't know if they're produced in Guernsey, but they have a frame in there which says one of them is 90% lean, the other one is 10% fat. They're the same thing. Okay? In studies, and there's multiple studies of this, the group that were given the 90% lean frame bought more chicken. Those who were given the 10% fat bought less. Okay? By quite a wide amount. Quite a wide amount. Okay? And I find that amusing, but it happens to me. I find it happening to me. And I'm annoyed sometimes and try and rationalise how I've managed to get in that situation. And you can imagine that maybe with chickens, buying a slightly, not the chicken that isn't exactly what you want may not be a big deal, but if these were financial instruments and they were framed differently and your future pension depended on it, then the situation becomes much more serious. Okay, so that's framing. Another one very close to it is anchoring. And anchoring is where you are given a piece of information. Here it says $469, implying that's how much this cotton shirt and pleat shirt dress, black grey OS, I don't know what that is that oversized, costs $469. Okay, that's what it would cost outside of the sale. In the sale price is $230. Now, if we're rational people, that initial price shouldn't matter to us at all. We should just be interested in the $230 and can we afford that or not, and is it going to buy us the clothes that we want. But it turns out if you vary that price, that $469, you get more sales the higher that price is. Okay? So if I increase that price to 669, keep the sale price that you're going to purchase at 230, I will get more sales. And I'm sure maybe some people slip into some of that activity. So that's quite important. The Daniel Kahneman's famous experiment, which gets often repeated, is one where he asks how many African countries are in the United Nations. And he asks a treatment group, or one group, and he asks what he calls a control group, another group, but he changes one thing. And he says, on the first group, he'll say, it could be more or less, do you think it's more or less 10%? That's what he just adds in. Do you think it's more or less 10%? And on the other group, he adds in, do you think it's more or less 65%? And continually, the answers are, and they've put all these studies together to create a meta-study, the answers are that if you say more or less 10%, you get an answer of 25%. Right? If you say more or less 65%, you get an answer of 45%. Okay, so all you've done is just say more or less. You've added that in, and what's happened is affected the person's thinking, and it's made them give a different answer than if you'd given them another anchor. Okay, so those are very important things for us to understand about the way people think, and I'm going to give an indication of how that will affect policy, how policies can use users use this to their advantage in a moment. Also, here's another factor that influences our thinking, and it's social norms. It's what other people are doing. I told you at the beginning, us economists, we weren't allowed to think that. we weren't allowed to think that others could affect our behaviours. And now I actually find that rather foolish saying that now, but that was actually the dominant way we thought. Here is an example where a solicitor firm agreed to be involved in a study, in an academic study. The solicitor firm sold wills. It carried out, it did a will form for the participants. So the participant meets the solicitor and is there for the reason of getting a will. What they did in the solicitor firm was split people up into 3 groups. First group is called a baseline group, and nothing was said to them about donating to charities. Nothing was said at all. And that group donated, on average, around £3,300 in their will. Second group were just asked directly, would you like to donate to a charity? Stop. Their number went down. Not much, so to around about the same, it went down to 3,100. The third group, the social norm group, were told many people give to charity when filling out their will. And would you like to donate? And you get double the amount. And this is a scientific study. This is not different people in these different groups. They're randomly allocated to these groups. So social norms, learning about how other people behave, can affect our behaviour. UK Tax Authority, HMRC, has changed information it puts on the tax form. So there are slow payers in taxes, particularly in the self-employed and those who have to fill in their own tax forms every year. There's quite a lot of slow responses. And what the Tax Authority have been telling people now is how many people in their area filled their tax form in last year by a certain date, by the appropriate date. So it's 92% of people completed their tax return in your area last year by the due date. That has led to increases in the speed of which people return their tax forms. Energy use. So in some areas, and this is in the US, you now are told the energy use of your neighbours. And you are given your bar next to their bars. And for those whose bar was higher, they had higher energy use than their neighbours, they've gone down. Now, they may have gone down anyway, but the likelihood is that they've gone down because they've been given this nudge, almost costlessly as well, which I think for policymakers, they ought to be taking that point on board. Some of these things are actually very, very low cost to implement. So those are the three areas that I wanted to talk about. We now want to move on to policy and how this can be useful for policy. So I think I said that the area of behavioural economics has been around since the early 70s, but it's the last 10, 12 years that it's been really influential in policy. The setting up of the nudge unit, Obama's administration has one as well. So there's now quite a lot of policy experiments to look at. And the first one just one sec, sorry. The first one I'm going to show you is to do with organ donation. And before doing that, though, I want to say something about the way behavioural economics policy making works. Normally, if you think about that chancellor that I mentioned, it's big. I've got a big idea. It's right for the whole country. Let's implement it, and maybe yes, we'll evaluate it later to see how it's working. Behavioural economics works really at the micro level, and it has to work many, many times across many, many small policies, and that's how, and then see how it's effective. So organ donation may not seem like the biggest policy area going, but if it can have a big impact here, and if that policy can be repeated, that area can be repeated in other parts of the health system, then you start to get significant effects. So there's no one big policy answer. It's lots of little things going on. So I'm going to show you, oh, it's the click, isn't it? Sorry. So yeah, it's all right. This is being flippant, but there's me from most of my economic life on the left, rational economic man, demand curves, supply curves, people. And actually what we found out is human beings may not be fully like Homer, but certainly have a lot more going on in their minds than, and probably maybe it's best to base economics more on this thinking than this thinking. Actually the reality is we're all very, very different. So I know a friend, he's a grandmaster chess player. He's unbelievably logical, unbelievably tidy. Definitely, the front of his brain is just really working all the time. And I've got friends who are unbelievably intuitive and find the dealing with these logical types very frustrating. And I think actually, as human beings, we're just all very, very different. And again, policymakers need to take that into account. Okay, so I said I'd talk about organ donation. I assume I don't need to state how important organ donation is. And I've seen situations where in the UK where we have low levels of organ donation, where the health service has been massively held up, enabled to assist and help people. So it's a really, really important area of healthcare. And there's two groups of countries here. There's the blues and the reds. The blues are where you have to have an explicit consent for organ donation. So you have to, what's called in the literature, opt in. The reds is where it's presumed consent. You've never had to sign a piece of paper at all. It's just assumed that if you were unfortunately to die, that your organs would be available for the health system. In countries where that's and you are allowed to opt out. That's the other important thing. So you do have this freedom of choice to be able to opt out. In this case, you can see that generally very, very low levels of opting out. They're all up near the 100% in terms of organ donation. And Sweden is slightly lower. And on the opt-ins, very, very low levels of opt-in. And it tells us a little bit about the way we think as human beings, is that we only have so much attention. There are only so many things that we can make choices about. And the cost, what's called the cognitive cost of finding out how you even opt in, is really quite high. I'm sure there's ethical issues for certain people about it as well. But I suspect that if we in the UK tomorrow move to you must, it's a presumed consent, you have to opt out, our number would just go up really, really quite high to the red level. Okay, so that's one area where understanding here, in this way, almost in this case, is understanding how lazy people can be, or how unwilling they are to look through all the issues on that they get able to choose from. I'm going to look at another. This one is to do with labour markets, subjects that I've worked on here in Guernsey over the years, particularly in terms of participation in the labour force and skills. What this is actual piece of public policy, so this is up and running. Again, remember I said about behavioural economics working at these micro levels on these what would seem like small policy areas. Here it's how can we persuade people who are unemployed, not working, to attend recruitment fairs. So that's all we want them to do, is attend recruitment fairs. Let's go to the left, the control group. This is of the group who are unemployed, around about 10%, if you don't do anything, other than some advertising, they will attend the recruitment fair. If you now decide to send them texts, the second red bar, you can see has gone up to 15%, and that's just sending the claimant some advice and reminding them. Third one is to just mention your name. You as the sender of the text saying, reminder that the fair is next Friday, and good luck, Michael. Third, the final one, is when you add a little bit of humanness to the text. And here, you're just wishing them luck, actually, and you're naming yourself. You're saying best of luck, or you're saying hope it all goes well, a little bit of human interaction, and that increases it by 25%. What's happening here is you're creating an association with the sender, and that there are some social norms working that not wanting to let down that person who's sent you the text. So rather than this sort of machine that sends out the text, please attend your appointment at 9 o'clock Friday morning, there is a personal element, you get better results. And there's quite a few studies that indicate this. Last one is, it's about dieting. And there is lots of evidence, lots of evidence, there is strong evidence that for the last 40 years plate sizes have got bigger. And there's actually now a campaign to reduce plate size, not because they think that's a good idea, because of the evidence. The evidence is if you move from a 12-inch plate to a 10-inch plate, you will reduce your calorie consumption by around 30%. Okay? Now that's just nice if you want to lose weight, but actually, in terms of the health system, it's really, really quite fundamental, because a whole load of long-tail ailments and things like diabetes can be really improved. Your chances of getting diabetes can be reduced substantially by reducing your calorific intake. And here is a simple method. In fact, my family, we've moved to these smaller plates, and we eat less. It works. I thought I'll leave that with you because it's a practical one that might be of interest to people. But don't forget the important element is that it can have a significant impact on policy. And there are a number of experiments and real policy examples of this. The book I really enjoyed reading most a couple of years ago was a book called Checklist. Has anyone come across Checklist? It's really quite a fundamental book. But the rate, this author is a surgeon, and the rate of which, and he worked in intensive care and worked in the carrying out operations. And he noticed that in certain professions they use checklists, and he started to think, do they have less mistakes in that checklist world. And he decided to introduce that into these intensive care theatres. And what he found was, there's quite a high level of infection in intensive care theatres. And that if you carried out a checklist, which is just go through systematically at the start of the operation exactly what everyone's job, what everyone's task is, and everyone carries that task out relative to the checklist, you reduce infections by 50%, really substantially. He had another element where he said that all he asked people to do, everything else stayed the same, but all he asked people to do was to, at the beginning of the operation, was to introduce yourself. So in intensive care, I guess in the US guy, there's different people that you're doing the operation with on any given time. And simply by introducing yourself and remembering, oh, I worked with them before, that reduced it another 5 percentage points. So this is psychology coming into policy and making a substantial difference. And as I said, there's many experiments like this. Okay, so how is this good for business? Well, leave aside the obvious that you within your business could use it. And I said in our business, we have, when our board felt like we weren't being efficient in our decision making and they were spending too long disagreeing around things, and we had to have a very open discussion about it, particularly as some people felt like it wasn't the place they wanted to be. We then brought in people with psychology backgrounds and taught us a way, through using this behavioural economics psychology approach, to have a better understanding of our colleagues and also expect and ask our colleagues to have a better understanding about the way we think. And it worked. We now, on a very important issue, do a very simple task, which is actually we're all allowed to go around the table and just have our 3 minutes worth. And you're not interrupted. That is sacred, your 3 minutes of taking a view on a particular issue. And we all have an expectation that we'll be listened to. So these are areas where within a business it can work. Because I'm, as I said and Martin said, I'm so keen on public policy working well, I've focused on that bit here. And one thing behavioural economics has brought to the party is testing. So I would say a large part of policy doesn't get tested fully to see if it's working effectively. And the behavioural economics is almost, you can't develop the idea without testing it. It's built in that it will be based on an experiment. And so testing and discarding what doesn't work, bringing on what does work, almost like scientists do, is something that they've introduced. And now the CMA, the big regulator in the UK that deals with competition, has introduced in terms of the banking inquiries, in terms of their remedies, they put in some tests. So before it was remedies all across the board, everybody must do. Might be right for some businesses, not right for others. Now it's, we think you should try, that these various policies should be tried and tested. And that's really very important for good policy making, that you know and have evidence that they're likely to work. Nudge policies are inexpensive, so that's good for our taxes. There's going to be less subsidies, less need for financial incentives. They are really about changing the frame, different anchor. These aren't expensive policy shifts. The doctor who, in the theatre, who simply asked people to say who they were and go through a checklist, not expensive. Policies can improve health outcomes. That's quite an important factor, I think. Now, I was talking to Martin earlier about the labour market and particularly older people in the labour market and how long now we're all expected to live. The idea that in a few years' time, that when I'll be close to what was called the standard retirement age, no way. I'm going to be working and I'm for a lot longer, and I'm going to be doing lots of different things. And if nudge can help us all be healthier in our older age, then we're going to be more productive and we're going to be able to contribute more to the economy. Less use of resources, I think it can be worked really well. Smart metering is one area where it can have an impact in reducing energy consumption, just knowing what's happening to other people, as I said earlier, and motivating employees, and I've touched a little bit on that, but I do feel knowing how your employees tick and knowing how you tick and avoiding conflict and finding ways forward which are productive for you and them can be aided by behavioural economics. One of the things I was born in North London and lived there, only ever lived in North London, and one of the things I love about coming to Guernsey is how polite people are here, and it is a really, and if you're not used to it, it's a really wonderful feeling. And this French cafe owner obviously felt the same thing because he wanted people to be polite. So he had his normal menu and then he added prix de café en terrasse, and it says un café, €7. Un café s'il vous plaît, €4.25. Bonjour, un café s'il vous plaît, €1.40. So what was he trying to do there? He was just trying to nudge us to be polite. He just wanted us to say bonjour, un café s'il vous plaît. And actually, I've been renovating a property for the last 10 years in France. And one thing I learned from my neighbours is that every time I passed it, if I just say bonjour, they love me. They like this Englishman who's in their town. And, and I think this is excellent, sort of neat, probably never read any of the behavioural economics books, but neat little way of just reminding people to be polite, and it's a nudge. Okay, thank you very much.
We're just going to take some questions for 10 minutes. If I could ask the first question. Obviously, nudge and nudge theory is all voluntary. You know, you're optioning out, you're optioning in. Nothing is forced upon you. But there is this issue that we have in Guernsey that if you try and change people's choices, it fits under this banner called social engineering.
Yeah.
Now, is social engineering just a matter of perspective? Is it?
Yeah.
Are we misunderstanding that actually social engineering is a good thing rather than perhaps a bad thing?
Yeah, yes, I think you are. I think the philosophy they use here, maybe you could say it's called social engineering. They call it paternal liberalism. So you are fundamentally making a choice still, but the paternal bit is the government are setting the frame. So they set that frame because they think policy is better if we have this, if we have high propensity for organ donation, let's say. So they think that's better policy, and they can judge to do that. And what they then use is this technique to say that's the default, we're going to stay there, but you do have the freedom to opt out. So it's not, old-fashioned Soviet socialism where you're just told what to do. You do have the freedom, but the driver, the start, is government deciding, yeah, we'd like the we'd like the policy to be set in this way.
John?
I've often believed in a Guernsey context we need less accountants and lawyers in politics and civil service and more marketing and advertising people, because our job is to sell policies rather than to rationalise them. Would you agree with that?
If they're good ones.
Yeah.
Somebody must be itching with questions. So.
It takes me to the sort of white witch, black witch idea, which is this approach, if used with good intent, can be very powerful with very positive payback. But if used in a different way, for example, I come from London, and it's very, very clear that it's a set policy of developers, property developers in London, if they want to put up a large tower, were putting master planning permission for a 32-storey tower. The neighbourhood gets very excited about it and rallies against it. And it's brought down to 20. And everybody's thrilled. So how does one combat, if you like, the black witch approach?
True. That's a good question. I'm assuming we're all living in liberal democracies, actually, where when I think about this, I put this in the hands of Vladimir Putin and wanting to influence people to do things that we might not be happy with, then I can see that it has its dangers. But I think in liberal democracies where we are open about what we're doing, so for example, with the opt-in, opt-out decision on pensions in the UK, you now have to opt out. There's a long consultation on that, a lot of debate about it, but we all knew what we were going into, and I think that you need that transparency in the government system, so that you know that the likelihood is of good policy, or there's good intent, and then you need testing. Is would it work well, and then use the model. On planning, I'd really love to think about how this could be used on planning, because I think it might be dangerous just to default to, well, we'll build whatever we like, and you then, the local public, can opt out. That might not be sensible. So I think you might need a more refined version of this. But just because I can't think of an answer, it doesn't mean it's not fully effective.
Jenny.
You said that around the boardroom that you have been able to nudge and to create the kind of atmosphere or ambience that you wish. How would you cope then with somebody who is completely sceptical and will not go along with you at all?
It's a bit like I said with the behavioural economics description of human beings, and I brought Homer and Dr. Spock, and then I said, actually, we're all really, really different. Yeah. We're all really, really different. And so some people bought into this really big time. I was a big fan. Some people thought, God, blimey, what are they up to now, and I'll live with it. But I think the important thing was the chair, is Gus O'Donnell, really wanted it, really believed in it. And I think the social norm bit of there's enough in the room supporting it means that people came on board. So I don't know the answer to if somebody had stuck it out. Maybe we would have just had to go back to the old world. But actually that didn't happen. But there were skeptics. And there were skeptics about the thing.
So they didn't just leave?
No. And in fact, and sometimes they don't get it and they do interrupt and they need to be reminded. But it helped me also. I think probably, if I'm open with you, I spent quite a lot of time thinking how frustrating they are. Why do they do that? And actually, this behavioural economics made me think, that's why they do that. Oh, that's why they're thinking that. That's why they behave like that. And you kind of almost absorb it, and then it helps you respond to them better. And by the way, I'm not saying our board is heaven on earth, but it is definitely working better than it used to be.
We're running out of time, so if we can make that the last.
Yeah, sure.
Question. Thank you.
Some of the public policy examples you gave tended to be kind of grounded in social policy areas, or areas where you're trying to change the public's behaviour and doing things. Can you give an economic development example, an example where you might bring about economic development through this?
Right, it's a good question, and I haven't got a magic wand for policy. But I did think on the way here that somebody may ask me about Brexit, partly because since June 23rd, every day someone is asking me about Brexit. And I think people who ask me, oh, well, how does this all fit into Brexit, are expecting a magic wand, one answer. And actually, this stuff works right at the ground. It's at the ground level on different policies. So if you're interested about economic development and growth, I wouldn't say this writes your strategy. might have some bits of it, behavioural economics in your strategy, but when you're actually putting in these policies, if it's about, you know, I know population growth is a big issue here and a new policy is being introduced, it might be that behavioural economics could be a useful component there in actually implementing the policy. And that, I don't have the answer, I don't say there is, by the way. It might be, and it is always worth the exploration. Decisions about or where you want firms to change their behaviours, then it may well be worth looking at nudges. Certainly, I think individuals. So it could be, say you want Guernsey to be attractive, because you want to really, I mean, keep it like it is today. That's the. But if you wanted it to be a really attractive place, so that people who came to visit here went back and said, "Well, come and visit Guernsey," you might. I don't know if you have, but you may have issues around rubbish collection. You may have issues about, you know, there's parts of Guernsey that are not so attractive. I wouldn't be surprised if some behavioural economics measures there could be useful about changing people's behaviour. About my brother, who lives in the west of Ireland, is a big keen. He lives in a small town, and they're very keen on winning the Tidy Towns competition, and they got close. And actually, when I go there, I do think they're a bit manic about it. But that there is something that without that Tidy Towns competition, it would be an untidier town. And all it is a nudge. It's a scheme to change people's behaviour.